I remember the sound of the shrine bell on my birth world and the way it trembled through the stone like a heartbeat. The smell of hot oil and incense climbing into the rafters, while my mother folded votive paper into tiny cranes that we set afloat on the drainage canals after evening prayer. The grit of ash on my tongue when the wind turned wrong, and the manufactoria vented waste across the habs, and I remember a hand on my shoulder that was gentle and calloused and human and will never touch me again because I am not the thing it once steadied. I am brother of the iron hands now, and the bell that moves me is the strike of the arming cog against my gorget as the servitors finish polishing the last plates of my Mark 7 and test the cant of my Vox grill. The years since the bell of my childhood can be counted, if one insists on counting, at a little more than 380, and some, enough that the paint on my left pauldron has been refreshed so many times. The layer beneath remembers campaigns I do not. I was 12 when the gunship cut a scar through the low cloud and the Iron Father stepped down with the gait of a man whose weight is mostly metal, and the promise he carried was not glory but function. The selection was simple and without ceremony, because ceremony wastes minutes, and minutes become casualties. Gene screening, breath control under cold stress, ascent without safety line along a spire that had shed its stairs centuries earlier. A test of darkness in which our minds were filled with recorded voices, whispering every fear we owned while we were expected to thread a needle with hands that shook because of the cold and not the voices. There were 89 boys from our hab blocks, and 31 were marked compatible. We were permitted no farewells. We were told to forget the route home. The route home forgot us more efficiently than we forgot it. The battle barge Ferrum Invictus swallowed us, and the first lesson was that everything inside it had a machine spirit to be appeased, and that flesh cooperates or it burns. The proving on Medusa was not a rite of passage so much as a thinning of a resource. We ran on ice that cracked without pattern. We slept standing in snow caves while augurs watched our heart rates and logged anomalies for later correction. We hunted in silence with shelters of slate and iron, and were hunted in turn by things that lived in the winds between the clan cities. We were assigned numbers to burn the softness from our names. The hypno-indoctrination began on the second week, and the catechisms slid into our heads in tones that leave no residue of argument. The organ work followed like the winter storms, secondary heart first, pulse doubling under the hand of the apothecary while he watched the runes and asked me to recite the litany of endurance without pausing when the pain arrived. Then os modula for the bones, and biscopia for the muscles, and hemastamen to change the blood, and Laraman's organ to seal the rents. A blade will open. Priomnor to sour the poisons before they sour me. Omophageia, so that the enemy's dead could teach me their last useful lesson. Catalepsy and node, to make sleep a choice rat, more her than a need. Melanochrome to harden me against the sun of worlds I will never call home. Ulitic kidney to sift death from my circulation. Neuroglottis so my tongue can read a battlefield like a dossier. Mucranoid for the void's chill. Betcher's gland to spit acid when the last weapon falls from my hand. Susan membrane to lie in a darkness that lasts for years, and claw back to wakefulness when duty knocks. Progenoids to seed the next generation who will never meet my eyes as men because boys do not meet the gaze of statues. And then the black carapace that opened my spine like a book and wrote machine script along it until the armor and I could speak without words. The Iron Father said the flesh is weak, and I learned he meant it the way a surgeon means a diagnosis, without hatred and without pity. The reclusium where I swore my oaths was iron and basalt, and the candles were electric filaments burning blue. The skull of Ferrus Manus looked down from the high niche, and I understood I was part of a lineage that had been broken at Istvan and repaired with bitterness and steel, and that I would never be expected to forgive the galaxy for that. Injury. My first deployment was a forge world whose name I remember because the Mechanicus stamped it on every bulkhead they built, a place that shook the air with the roar of production and the scream of heresy below the sound. Dark Mechanicum sigils crawled along crane booms, and the cultists in their red robes carried ritual blades that had learned to hum when they tasted sanctified oil. We went in through the intake stacks under the veil of smog with auspex blind and moved by touch and vox pulse, and the rule of angles that works whether one is watched or not. The bolt shells we used were the standard pattern, and they taught bodies to break in a disciplined way. We cut out the shrine at the center of the pattern, a fusion of flesh and engine that wanted to think. My squad leader put a melter charge where its thought touched the reactor manifold, and we left with the heat rising behind us. The order of operations is simple. We destroy the thing that coordinates, then the smaller things learn to die without instruction. After that, a planet called Vardax that coaxed ore out of asteroids like priestesses coax confession from the guilty. Orcs had nested in the docking frames and turned loading rigs into battering rams. The void fights were knife work at 70 meters per second, and not all of us learned to love the way. A boarding torpedo smashes expectation flat. I learned to pin a greenskin under a mag-booted heel and feed him 2 rounds before his arm knew it had been cut away. There was tyrannid work during a long campaign whose days were all the color of bruises. Spores fell until the sky grew tired, and we burned them until the oceans boiled low, and then we held a line on a ridge of black glass, while the gaunts came like rain with teeth. When my bolter coughed on emptiness, I used my combat knife. And when the knife snapped, I used the broken haft, and when that splintered, I used my wrists. The apothecary laughed when he cleaned the ichor from my throat, and told me I had finally learned the taste of the enemy, and that I should spit more often and swallow less. The victories recorded neatly, the reverence paid to the machine spirits that carried us and mended us and allowed us to carry and mend. Between campaigns, there were pacifications, because the Imperium is not a straight line, but a knot of obligations. A hive where workers barricaded themselves in hab tiers made from refitted cargo containers because the tithe increased and the food decreased. And someone with a pleasant voice on the Vox told them that if they bled together they might bleed less. The Arbites asked us to open corridors through which law could flow. The Vox picked up crying and laughter and the hiss of cooking oil, and we moved floor by floor. Every door a geometry problem, every face a variable. A woman stepped into my field of fire with a wrapped bundle against her chest. My auspex saw metal in the bundle, and I saw a potential charge. And I fired once and stepped past, because time wasted becomes casualties, and someone behind me threw a frag to end the debate in the next room, and the blast lifted loose. Plastic sheeting, and the air smelled of burned sugar. Afterward, I tried to remember what her eyes looked like, and found that the memory had no detail, because the doctrine teaches us that detail belongs to threat profiles and not to obstacles. The Iron Father told me that this meant the catechism had rooted properly, and I recited the litany of clarity until I believed him. Later, there was a Death Watch secondment because the chapter and the Ordo Xenos shared debts and tools. And I spent 12 standard solar cycles. N black with a silver arm. We killed a gene-stealer cult, whose patriarch had learned to sing a liturgy that was almost beautiful, if one forgets the words. We burned the chapel out from under him before he could finish the hymn. We boarded a Tau courier during a dinner held by a governor who had set real fruit on a table for the first time in 15 years, so that the water-caste would feel respected. We went in when the music rose, and the governor's face cracked when he understood the calculation that was happening around him, and he kept his hands to himself as we did. What purity requires when purity is a strategic posture. Afterward, the Inquisitor made a speech about contagion of ideas, and the governor nodded in the right places, and a week later, an Ordo detachment hanged him for nodding at all. There was also a slow, quiet war against a splinter fleet in a system whose light died while we were there. We listened to the Geller field sing to itself as we transited and watched the murals writhe when the storms outside pressed their faces against the hull because the warp is always nearby when the work is important. There were crusades with Black Templars whose zeal burns loud and hot, and it warmed our cold for a time. There were joint actions with the Salamanders who tried to talk to refugees, the way a father talks to a child who has a fever, and I stood 3 steps back and watched and catalogued and could not bring myself to speak because duty had trained me to communicate in angles and arcs and ammunition counts. The centuries adjusted me more than I adjusted them, and the meta, LS, crept into me the way frost creeps along a window's edge. My eye went when a shard of Xenos armor learned a new way to fly, and now its replacement sees spectrums I never knew existed. My left humerus is not bone now, and the machine that lives there hums when storms are coming. The Iron Hands call this improvement, and they are not wrong. I have become a stable platform for the expression of force. There was an exterminatus that I helped prepare, and I will record it because to refuse to write a line in the ledger is a kind of lie, and lies are soft. The planet was a seeding ground for a pox that learned quickly, and the Inquisitor pronounced the sentence with a mouth that did not shake. Our role was to confirm the spread pattern and mark the shelters so the virus bombs did not waste time seeking them. We did it quickly because we are good at our work, and then we climbed and watched the atmosphere go milk white and slough away, and the deserts below turned smooth and then darker, and the vox chatter on the command deck was composed of numbers and checklists that mean a clean task. At the edge of the view line a storm was building, and it reminded me for a moment of the ash storms of my childhood, and the way my mother would pull the shutters across and light the shrine lamp and press my fingers against the bell rope, so I could feel the vibration run up my arm and into my chest. The memory arrived without request and left without permission, and I learned that some pieces of flesh refuse to be weak even when encased in ceramite. I have trained recruits and met their eyes while they we-sighed, learned the vocabulary of pain, and watched the catalogue of their old lives grow shorter in their heads. I have taught them how to step over a brother without a pause when the fire geometry demands it, and how to leave their names at the doors of the arming chapel, because names can tangle in a trigger finger. I have watched serfs age out of service while I remain the same. I have put my hand on the sarcophagus of a dreadnought and spoken to a voice that remembers the siege of a city that was already a ruin when I was a child, and I have heard him ask to be shut down for a season because dreams had found a way to survive the coolant. I do not dream when I can help it, because the catalepsian node keeps watch even when I am still, and because the things that visit when the node relaxes have learned to wear familiar shapes. The Imperium calls us angels, and that word implies a heaven and a choice, and we are granted neither. We are a function executed at scale across a span so large that its map becomes religion. I have stood in the vaults of the Reclusium and watched Iron Fathers polish the skull of a Primarch who died under iron hands not his own, and I see the lesson repeating in us with every corrective surgery, with every plate added, with every litany that sands the edges from a memory until it becomes something that does not cut. I have spoken the catechisms at the lip of a crater full of enemies who died too slowly. I have whispered the names of brothers I can remember and recorded the numbers of those I cannot. Sometimes I try to imagine what it would be like to choose a thing because it is beautiful rather than because it is necessary, and the imagination burns out in the first second because the habit of necessity chews truth into fuel faster than beauty can say its first word. I am not ashamed of this because shame is about self, and the self is a weak joint that we have bolted over. If you are asking whether I would change what I am, then you are asking a cathedral to become a tree, and you are ignoring how much weight the cathedral holds. There is an argument that says we save more lives than we end, because the galaxy beyond the hull is full of teeth, and the Imperium requires hard instruments, and I have made that argument to men who needed to hear it, and to boys who did not. And it is correct enough to keep the wheels turning. The truth underneath is simpler. I will fight until my blood runs black with stim and coolant. I will hold until my armor seizes and my limbs are welded into angles the apothecaries cannot unlock. I will die in a manner that allows another to move forward 5 meters farther than they could have without my body in the way. I will be recovered or not, and remembered or not, and logged either way, because logging keeps the machine spirits calm. Children will look up at a fresco and see a figure whose outline resembles mine, and they will think the word angel and never learn the weight of the plates inside the paint. The bell from my childhood rings in me sometimes, a phantom tone under the low hum of the reactor and the thin whine of my servo joints. When I kneel to clean my bolter, I am not comforted by it, because comfort is a softness the galaxy does not spare. Yet I note its presence with the same precision. I note the wear along a feed lip. I am a space marine of the Adeptus Astartes of the Iron Hands chapter, and I am the cold certainty that meets a threat in the corridor where it thinks it cannot be met. I am the hand that closes on a lever and pulls because it must be pulled. I am a weapon that remembers being a boy in the instant before the trigger breaks, and that is the sum of my humanity, and it is enough to focus the shot. I will continue, because continuation is our only prayer and our only answer. The flesh was weak. We made it strong. The strong endures. The strong obeys. The strong does the work, and leaves the questioning to priests and philosophers and ghosts. I will fight until the last bell in the last shrine shakes itself silent, and if there is a heaven for things like me, it will be a bench in a quiet armory with oil on the air, and a weapon across my knees that needs cleaning, and a moment in which no one is calling my name, and the tremor that moves through the stone will feel like a heartbeat again. I remember the thin smell of oil in a manufactorum shaft, and the way a human hand can be measured against a servo gauntlet until it seems to vanish. But that is not where this begins. This begins with the work. Because the work is the shape of my life, and it is the thing that has replaced hope, breakfast, and lullabies. We entered through a vent shaft on a world that had once been called a colony, and was now a map of strategic nodes and supply lines, and the vent spat us into the belly of a sea. Itty that had learned to worship noise, the air tasted of scorched cloth and electrical fire, and a local militia, expecting pacification, had turned their scrap into something schematic and cruel. They had dug a nest into an old refinery and wired it with traps that sang when you put your foot wrong. We pushed forward in pairs and trios, every corner a calculus of velocity and lethal geometry. My bolter spat disciplined answers while my power fist closed the argument when the enemy tried to make one. A boy with a patched respirator reached for a grenade as I passed, and I crushed the throw with a palm and fed 2 rounds into his throat, because time wasted becomes casualties, and the doctrine carved that fact into us like script on a beam. After the sweep, the chaplain read a litany in a corridor that stank of sweat and oil, and the recruits who had watched me did not ask whether what we had done was right, but how to do it cleaner, faster, with fewer broken parts to tend later on. That is the body of our work. A series of tasks performed under a dozen kinds of stress, until the duty becomes reflex, and reflex becomes identity, and the identity is a tool that wakes before dawn and sleeps only under order. We patched, we looted, we catalogued, we left a tally that fit into the logistics chain and carried the names of the dead as numbers, because names tangle in triggers. We learned to move like the machine that holds us, and to think in angles that prevent surprise. We were efficient, and the galaxy needed efficiency, the way a wound needs cauterizing. Sometimes the cautery kills the limbu, but the body survives. And that is the arithmetic by which we measure success. There were exultant moments that the clerks in the chapter records would call victories. An orbital insertion above a tyrannid world where our fire downlinked in patterns that carved scars through the swarm and left a horizon full of steam. The chant of the Vox on the command deck told of mission parameters satisfied, and the biosensors on my chest hummed approval. Even while a spore cloud grazed the hull and the servitors tuned filters to keep the screaming. And out, we sealed the breach, and the swarm retreated in ragged threads. The tech priests called it containment and called it necessary. The numbers were recorded, and the estimate for civilian survival was acceptable. and we moved on to the next node because the Imperium is a ledger, and ledgers do not grieve. In between there were pacifications for which historians would invent euphemisms, a province where an agrarian caste raised pitchforks when the tithe demands rose, and the planetary governess sent a petition that read like a prayer, which the upper houses ignored. We were sent to enforce the law, and we enforced it with the precision taught by 100 simulations. Bolt rounds through barricades, melter where the walls were thick, flame to clear nested positions. We open doors like surgeons because doors that remain closed become clinics for traitors. The woman with a child who stepped into our lane was a variable that the augur marked as a threat, and I neutralized the threat because my job is to neutralize threats. Afterward, the chaplain told us compassion can be a liability, and the recruits nodded because they had watched my hand and learned the lesson without words. There were contracts with the Inquisition where nuance is a liability and obedience a virtue. We struck a diplomatic table, where a Tau envoy sat opposite a governor hoping to trade water for medicine. The feast had the pretense of civility, and the room had the stench of calculation. We breached at the signal, and the envoy bled an intelligent red across the tablecloth, while the governor flinched and then stood in the correct posture and learned the correct speech in the right cadence. The files later called it prevention. The Ordo called it necessary. On another world, we mapped the rise of a cult and fed its leaders to the shredders, because the cult promised a different faith, and the Imperium keeps one canonical narrative. Extermination is always the blunt instrument, and we wield it with the calm of a surgeon who has never lost a patient to doubt. Over centuries I have stood at the mouth of cities and watched them learn to fear our shadow, and then call us saviors in the bright months, when raiders came and we bled them out with interest. That ambivalence in the populace is the rule rather than the exception. The civilian is a vector of variables, and their lives are weighted against supply nodes and fuel lines, and the calculus rarely favors sentiment. There is a tactical clarity in that cruelty that stabilizes regions and allows the bigger gears of empire to turn without catching on soft material. Yet there are nights between campaigns when the mechanics of compliance appear to me bare as bone, and I see that we are tending a system that preserves itself by pruning what does not fit. On a nameless world, we executed an operation that the archives will never name. It was an elimination of a genetic experiment that had birthed a people modified to survive places the Imperium intended to claim. They had features that exceeded baseline humanity and lived longer and thought in ways our clerks could not neatly place into boxes. We were the instrument chosen because normal regiments might balk at killing families, and administrators might find mercy a mistake. We entered like a law and left like a sanitation. They sang when they died, a choir of voices in tunnels chewing on the last beauty their architects could build. I shot through that sound with rounds that severed the melody into echoes, and I watched their world go molten from arc bombardment, while the sensor suite logged a clean kill and a stop to contamination. Standing on the command deck as crust turned to glass, I felt a memory like a stone in a sock. The taste of sweet bread my mother made on a cold dawn, where the manufactoria hissed and she folded prayer into the dough. The recollection came and left, and I filed it away, because memories are data points to be evaluated for operational risk. The apothecaries observed me and suggested recalibration of the neural dampeners, and I let them tune the edge off because a memory that interrupts a rule is an inefficiency. The surgeries were many. Each one wrote another sentence in the manual of my body. Secondary hearts. Os module. Episcopia, hemastamen, catalepsian nodes, the black carapace that married me to armor and made my spine a conduit of machine will. They taught me to accept pain as instruction and to use absence as a tool. The training eroded tenderness the way rain erodes chalk, and tenderness is an indulgence the chapter cannot afford. In field hospitals, I have watched brothers who could not accept the necessary forgetting break and ask why, and the apothecary would reply with measured care and a scalpel that cuts the temptation out, and the man would sleep and awaken like a reconditioned piece of kit, and step back into the formation. Empathy is a leak in a hull, and we patch leaks mercilessly. Tactically, the results are tidy. Our kill ratios show efficiency. Supply lines stay open longer. Nodes remain productive. The administratum updates maps with fewer red zones and the machine hums. Morally, the tapestry is frayed. But moral questions are for philosophers and priests and dead men who had time to write treatises. We do not have that luxury. We have orders and we execute them. I have watched the Death Watch for a season, and there the lines are more convincingly black and white. Xenos are Xenos, and their extinction is policy, and that clarity is a kind of mercy. But even there we were called to an encounter with a Tau delegation, and we unmade a possibility of trade that might have prevented famine on 3 worlds because policy forbids compromise, and someone in a chamber far from battle decided that purity outweighs survival. We executed the order with the calmness of trained instruments and left a planet that might have had vaccines to rot a little longer because the ledger favors ideology over flexibility. There are moments of dark lucidity in which the pattern resolves itself into something worse than cruelty. We are enforcement, not guardians. We are stability, not salvation. We preserve the Imperium by pruning autonomy at scale, and the pruning takes lives that once had reasons to continue. I have commanded squads, and I have taught young serfs to make the right cut. And they learned quickly because the method works. A squad that hesitates, dies, and a squad that believes in the sanctity of its instruments lives long enough to stabilize a sector. The operational truth is cruel, and it sustains infrastructure across light years. Yet when I close my eyes in the wake of an operation, I sometimes see a face I cannot recall. And I measure the gap between what should be remembered and what is logged, and I realize I have become efficient enough to forget the question of why I am efficient. The liturgies the chaplains intone are full of words that mean duty, and the servitors keep lists and the records are tidy, and the priests have roads on the maps, and everyone sleeps easier because someone somewhere keeps order. I do not protest this because protest requires the capacity to weigh the world against the tally, and that capacity atrophied in me like a limb left unused. There are campaigns where the enemy is obvious, and our work is righteous without complication. Tyrannid swarms that devour biomass and leave nothing but silent worlds. Orc warbands that butcher for sport and mal or ice. These are simple mathematics, and we are good at mathematics. We push the variables until the threat is neutralized and the gears turn again. Yet in the quiet pockets between those battles, we enforce taxes, we break uprisings, we destroy an experiment that could have given humanity a different path. We cut because cutting keeps the system fed. We are the surgical blade in a machine that fears growth beyond its borders. I have tried to imagine a life that chooses beauty instead of necessity, and the thought burns out because the habit of necessity consumes imagination like rust eats iron. I am not proud of that extinction, but pride is illogical in the ledger. If asked whether I would change what I have become, I would answer with the precision of a metrics report. The cost of refusal is innumerable lives lost to the chaos beyond, and the numbers of citizens saved by our interventions are heavy and measurable. The moral calculus tips toward continued service when counted in columns, and so I continue. I will continue to step into breaches, to hold corridors while civilians escape or do not, to break down doors so a supply convoy can pass, to be the blunt instrument that studies nuance from a distance, to teach recruits how to make clean decisions without sentiment, to polish the skulls of ancestors and recite the litanies so the machine spirits remain calm. The memory of a mother folding paper cranes sometimes surfaces like a splinter, and I let the apothecary tune the edges out and return to formation. I will fight until my joints fuse with alloy, until the black carapace seizes, until the apothecaries cannot coax the rust away. I will die in a way that gains 5 meters for the man behind me and stabilizes an objective, and that is the prayer I have. Stripped down to essentials and made acceptable, continuation is our only offering, and we give it because that is what is asked of us. We are Adeptus Astartes, and we are the cold certainty that answers a threat with fire and edge. We are guardians in name and wardens in practice. We are what the Imperium commissioned, and we are what it keeps. And in the engine room of the galaxy, our function is simple and absolute, and for reasons that belong to histories and not to us, necessary. The work did not slow when the stars tore. It only changed shape. There was a night in the void when every lumen on the command deck bled into a bruise color, and the astropaths screamed with mouths that did not open, and a split ran through the display like a knife through cloth, and the chartists wrote new edges on old roots, while Iron Fathers sealed the chapels and told us to audit every oath, because oaths are rivets, and a ship with loose rivets breaks. The great rift opened, and the galaxy behaved like a machine that had been heated beyond tolerance. Supply schedules went thin. Vox traffic multiplied into panic. Worlds that had been within a week's run were now a gamble of months. We adjusted because that is what we are engineered to do. There was a Black Legion warband pressing a shrine moon until its surface sounded like a drum under bombardment. We translated in under a curtain of debris and made a line from a shattered basilica to a crater rim that overlooked the landing fields, and the enemy tried to flow around the edges and found that the edges were teeth. I remember a champion in horned plate carving a path with a blade that hummed like a live wire, and I met him under the broken rib of a statue, and our blows rang against the stone until the head fell, and we both stepped through dust as if we were walking through an old prayer. His blade took the paint from my pauldron, and my fist broke the argument inside his chest, and I felt the machine in my arm thrum as the power pack bled nearly dry. Afterward the shrine moon rose again in the tally that passes for faith. The serf's pie teared a new line of honors along our armor, and the Iron Father scratched one mark from my nameplate, because iron hands do not collect decorations the way some chapters do. We collect data and effective habits. During that bitter season, the chapter received new brothers who had been made in forges we did not know, and who stood a head higher in their armor and carried bolt rifles that flattered range and discipline. Primaris. They called themselves by a classification rather than a boast. There was argument in the halls where the old iron speaks. Some asked whether a gift from a Magos who had slept through 10 millennia carried debts we could not calculate. Most of us measured the new variables the way we measure ammunition quality and recoil impulse. If a tool cuts cleaner, we learn its balance, and we do not love or hate it. We integrate it into the work. I trained beside them on a gunmetal parade square that swallowed sound. Their lungs drank the cold more slowly. Their steps carried weight with a new cadence. One of them asked me whether I remembered being small, and I told him I remembered being human, and that memory is useful only when it shows you where weakness hides. We folded them into the line, and the line held. There was a boarding action against a renegade cruiser whose machine spirit had been flattered into madness by a heretic choir. We cut in through the dorsal spine with cracked collars and stepped into corridors that sweated oil and scripture writ backward. The gravity was intermittent, so we fought in skids and kicks and bursts. A squadmate lost purchase and drift, across a kill lane, and I caught him with a mag clamp and threw him into a recess, while a rotary cannon spooled up and ate the wall where he had been. We moved room by room, cutting power trunks, slaying bridge crews who wore medals made from coins they had stolen from the dead. In the Strategium, we found a navigator whose third eye had been stitched shut with wire, and a crew who prayed to a compass that always pointed inward. We put them down with the same measured compassion we give to old equipment that cannot be repaired. Scuttling charges ticked like insect legs in the walls, while we withdrew along our own cutting paths. The blast lifted the dorsal plating in a flower of iron, and the ship folded itself neatly into the void. We left no message behind, because messages are wasted on those who will not listen. On a mining moon, where the nights froze breath into white ropes, we ran a counterinsurgency that asked for patience as much as force. A charismatic clerk had persuaded 3 hab stacks that the administratum's tithe formula contained an error, and that error could be corrected with a rifle. He was wrong in his arithmetic and right in his hunger. And that is a mix that breeds dead children. We unspooled in the dark and mapped the pattern of his supply lines. We leaned on one node after another until the rifles clicked on emptiness. When he emerged to preach courage into a frightened knot of men, I walked through their ranks like a wind and took him by the front of his coat and told him the only mercy I carry is speed. Then I gave him that speed and watched the knot of men turn back into miners who wanted to go home. We left a Vox crate with recorded instructions on rationing and repair and a warning about errors in ledgers. The administratum arrived a week later and rewrote the ledgers anyway. I have stood in chapels with salamanders who stayed behind to lift roof beams from trapped civilians with their bare hands, and I have watched those civilians bring water and bread and hold their children up to see the men who had hands warm enough to save them. I have fought with Raven Guard, whose shadows moved like patient animals, and with Cadians whose eyes had learned to count artillery and pretend fear is a number that can be managed. I have learned from all of them, and I have taught what Iron Hands teach, that sentiment cannot be allowed into the room where decisions are made because it will ask for a seat, and then ask for a vote, and then ask you to hold. Holding can be fatal when an enemy is counting on you to remember your heart. There was a world where the people had built wind harps on the ridgelines, so the whole valley sang when storms passed. The harps were beautiful, and the heretics who came to claim the temple at the valley's floor were not. We fought down the slope, while the harps screamed thin and sweet, and in the melee, a power blade cut through one of the instrument frames, and the music changed from song to a machine's sob. Later, after the temple was cleansed, and the priests recited gratitude as if reading a maintenance schedule, I walked back to the ridge and stood among the broken strings and listened to the wind. It sounded like a memory of a memory. My brother in clan command asked whether I sought contrition, and I told him I sought calibration. He nodded, because the word is honest in our dialect, and we filed a request to rebuild the harp under ecclesiarchy authority. The request was denied because budgets write their own prayers. On a frontier fortress, where the ice grows teeth at the edges of the habdomes, we rotated through garrison, and our enemies were cold. Hunger and a slow kind of despair that makes serfs drop tools and stare past the bulkheads at a horizon that looks like a clean way to end a list. Our work there was sermons of steel and habit, patrols on schedules that taught wolves to wait, inspections that taught serfs their names were seen and therefore real, a single decisive raid against a raider pack that had learned the patrol pattern of a convoy and thought mathematics could be beaten with courage. We corrected them with a pincer that closed like a trap and left 36 bikes smoking blue in the snow. We took one alive because knowledge is the only mercy that multiplies. He told us what his tribe believed and what they feared and which direction their dead were buried, and I wrote it down because even useless details can keep a mind from rusting. There was a campaign by the light of a star that had gone old and red and mean. Necrons woke under the sand and unfolded themselves like knives sliding out of their sheaths. Their weapons draw light out of the air in lines that make a man feel small and temporary. We learned the pace of their reanimation cycles and broke them by timing our charges against those windows. We learned to target the nodes under their command pylons and to trust our machine spirits to eat their edge while we pressed. I watched a brother fall and rise and fall and rise because his Susan membrane dragged him back to function, and each time his armor looked more like the wreckage of a shrine, and he kept moving because duty is a program written into us too deep to erase. On another day, I was pinned under collapsed hab plating that smelled of laundry soap and carbon fumes, and I listened to the weight talk to the joints in my armor while my brothers cut. The catalepsian node ticked in a steady line through my skull, and I counted it to keep the edge of panic away. Panic is an inefficient use of oxygen, and the Preomna does not digest it. When the plate lifted, I saw a child hiding under a bench with a toy carved to look like a knight. He stared at me, the way the very young stare at storms, and I told him to keep the toy because sometimes a symbol is a battery that gets you through a winter, and then I logged the interaction because the habit of logging keeps us honest. There have been times when I burned through a magazine in a room full of traitors, and times when I placed my hand in blessing on a generator that had run 1 week beyond safe tolerances and whispered the litany to soot and spark so that machine spirit would not take offense at my impatience. There have been hours when the only thing between a convoy and ruin was my body in a doorway and a prayer to talk and friction. There have been days when the only thing I killed was day, out in a recruit's face, and I count those kills because they make the other kind possible. The body of my life is made of repetitions. Clean the weapon, check the seals, review the plan, move, kill, hold, extract, report, repair, drill, recite, sleep if permitted, wake if called. A discipline that becomes a map. You can walk in the dark. In that dark, sometimes the past strikes like a hammer. The smell of sweet bread, the weight of a bell rope in a child's fingers, the way my mother's hand tugged once to say enough and once to say finish the pull. The memory glints and then sinks into the sump of the mind and leaves the surface smooth. The apothecaries say, "This is healthy." They are not wrong. If I carried every face and every smell and every word, I would move slower and time wasted becomes casualties. So I do what all of us do. I carry enough to keep the blade honest, and I let the rest fall through. The galaxy is not a place that forgives the soft. We are not asked to be soft. We are asked to function. And function we do until the tally at the end writes us down in the same ink it uses for the enemies we removed, and the bridges we held, and the farms that harvested because we were there. That ink is black and thin, and it dries quickly. The next line waits. The next task spins up, the next order arrives. We answer because answering is what we are. There was a wintering campaign on a fortress world at the lip of the rift, where the aurora ran like cold fire across the sky, and the air tasted of iron. The garrison had thinned to bone, and the governor had bartered fuel for loyalty, until both grew scarce. We arrived beneath a moonsicle, and the vox was heavy with broken prayers. The enemy wore the ragged colors of men who once bowed to the Aquila, and who had been taught a new catechism by traitor priests. They had dug mortars into courtyards, paved with family names, and sited heavy stubbers in choir lofts. Our first push met a barricade of city coaches bolted into a wall and wired to the hab grid. They tried to cook us in our plates with stolen current, and learned that our insulation was older and angrier than their idea. We crossed under the crackle of residual voltage and wrote the barricade off the map with close work. One squad cleared a hospital that had become a sniper's nest and found the wards stacked with empty cots and ration tins, folded into little animals to occupy frightened hands. The little animals were neat and careful, and I crushed one under my boot because the sight tried to insert itself into a part of me that must remain uncluttered. A day later, we ran a corridor through an administratum spire and found its scriptorum still warm. The clerks had fled, but the ink in the wells had not yet filmed, and the pages on the desks were filled with numbers, and the numbers told of a tithe increase that no world could satisfy without breaking its own bones. The chaplain read the pages the way one reads a casualty report and filed them in a bin marked doctrinal clarity. We kept moving, and the city bent under the weight of our method. The enemy tried to counter with ambushes that had courage and poor timing. The governor stood before us on the 4th, an evening with a voice like a coin rolling across a table, and asked if the worst was over, and my captain told him, "The worst is a shape that adapts, and you will meet it again." We departed under a sky that glowed like old copper. Our hull took 2 parting shells that scratched the paint, and the machine spirit purred at the compliment. On the transit out, I drilled recruits until their minds forgot that sleep is a need, and remembered that stillness can be a tactical position. One of them asked if the lesson ever ends, and I told him lessons end when we do. He did not nod because he knew that was not comfort, and did not expect it to be. We made contact then with a convoy in trouble at the rim of a system that should have been quiet. The auspex showed a scatter of civilian hulls and the hard angles of raider signatures closing. We slid in fast along a vector that pinned the raiders between our launch bay and the sun, and we gutted the first strike craft with the opening volley. They tried to break and found the exits walled with our speed. We cut in boarding teams and moved through vessels that had been refitted for speed and humiliation. Chains on bulkheads, hooks in the ceilings, decks washed with brine to keep the smell down. The raider lord wore a stolen officer's coat and a string of tokens that had been fingers once. He raised a pistol with a carved grip and an oath that sounded like a joke. I took his arm at the elbow and his head an instant later and left both on the deck, because trophies do not belong to us. We sanitize. We do not decorate. We towed the convoy back into safe lanes, and their captains signaled gratitude with a chime sequence that is as old as the first void relay. The sound reminded me of the bell on my home world, and I caught the memory as it rose. I turned it over like a priest turns over a relic to check for cracks, and then I placed it back in its box. Later there was an action with an allied chapter that believed zeal answers every question better than patience. Their sergeant barked slogans at recruits the way a man throws rocks at a dog to make it mean. I watched and said nothing, and later took one recruit aside and showed him how to strip a bolt gun without thinking, because thinking sometimes gets between a man and the right habit. He listened, and the gun clicked together with a sound that always satisfies. The war shifted its weight again, and we found ourselves hunting a warband that wore black and bronze and had found an enshrined reliquary to defile for sport. They painted blasphemies in languages that had been outlawed since men wrote history with fire. We entered a cloister with floors of white stone and walls covered in patient gold leaf, and the first thing I noticed was the smell of cooking oil. The traitors had taken the kitchens and turned them into a barricade. The sisters who had held the shrine to their last magazine lay in lines that looked like they were still praying. We stepped around them and took the kitchens by grenade and maglock charge. When the smoke cleared, a single pot of something sweet still simmered because a sister had left it there when the bells started. I drove a fist through the stove and threed. Sweetness turned to black. Devotion is not a sauce, and we cannot be allowed its taste. After that we went below the reliquary to the ossuary, where bones rest against bone in the long patience that faith teaches. The heretic champion had hammered iron into the skulls and spoken to them as if they would answer. I answered for them. He died with a look like a mirror turned away from the light. In the weeks that followed, there was a mission of a different shape. A research station on the limb of a blue gas giant had gone silent, and the Mechanicus asked us to recover their work if it could be recovered, and to sterilize if not. We docked to a port that opened like a reluctant mouth, and found the corridors filmed with frost and a gentle rain of dust drifting under broken grav plates. Servitors lay curled like sleeping dogs in maintenance alcoves, and their ports unplugged. The cogitators still ticked in slow beats as if counting prayers. We reached the primary lab and found a circle of chairs set around a hololith with a series of melodies scrolling across it. The notes were mapped to stellar readings, and the tech magos had been teaching the machine to sing the giant storms. They had died at their posts when the generator coughed its last, some from the cold, one from a bad decision to open a panel with his bare hands. We studied the data and found nothing heretical, nothing dangerous, except a kind of beauty that belongs in chapels and starfields. We copied the research, and the Iron Father asked the machine spirit for its blessing, and we gave the station back to the cold, on Depar. Sure, I thought for a moment of the wind harps on the ridge we had broken, and of the request to rebuild that went unfunded, and I felt the old urge to be angry, and the habit of discipline closed on that urge like a vice, and I recited the mantras until the shape of anger passed. There was a compliance action on a manufactorum planet, where the overseers had decided to play with quotas the way children play with switches, on and off, and more and less without regard for bodies. The workers built barricades from broken machines and gave them names like Defiance and Pray for Bread. I admire the accuracy of their poetry and not the purpose. We cut through defiance with melter and through pray for bread with shaped charges, sized to preserve a structural column behind it. The column mattered because a bridge above it carried raw ore to furnaces that fed a fleet. The bridge must stand. The column must stand. The bodies are variables that do not enter the same line of the equation. Afterward, I sat in a machine shrine while a tech acolyte cleaned a grease stain from a gear with a brush made from the hair of an ancestor, and I told him the work mattered, and he looked at me the way young men look when their faith hurts, and nodded. We traveled then under orders from an inquisitor whose sigil was sharp and whose eyes weighed everything in a room. She directed us to a world that had gone quiet. In a way, silence goes quiet only when something watches it. Probe returns showed heat signatures in old transit tunnels. We dropped in low and used silent approach. The first auger hit came as a tremor too, regular to be tectonic. We followed it to a vault, older than the cathedral above. The doors had been sealed from the inside and the seals warded with lines that once meant sanctuary. We cut the wards with shaped charge and prayer. Inside we found a population that had taken shelter months before. They had refused the governor's order to move to the harvest camps, because the camps had become factories for bodies. They had arranged themselves in circles around an old bell that had fallen from the ruined cathedral. They had brought books and seeds and the bones of their dead, and they had kept a school in one corner where children traced letters with bits of charcoal on old slate. They did not attack. They did not cheer. They watched us. The inquisitor arrived and asked their elder for records, and for truth, and for submission to a quarantine that would not end. He told her the truth as he understood it, and asked for a corridor to the spaceport, and a promise that the men who had set up the camps would answer for their arithmetic. She listened and filed his words in a pocket inside a larger coat where such words go. She ordered us to separate the healthy from the suspected and to move the suspected. A woman stepped forward with a child in her arms and stood in the wrong place. My auspex flagged metal in the wrappings. I lifted my bolt gun and fired. The child was a wrapped machine, a clever decoy. The hallway erupted into chaos. Some tried to flee. Some tried to rush us. The Inquisitor's stormtroopers did their training credit. When the room fell still, the bells ill lay mute, and the elder sat down on a step and put his face in his hands. We secured the vault. The Ordo saw to the rest. We extracted, and the Inquisitor thanked us with a nod that weighed as much as a medal. I have learned that nods like that keep worlds in orbits they would otherwise slough. Some part of me still heard a bell that could not ring. In the aftermath, the Iron Father conducted the standard audit of spirit and function. He asked if anything inside me had become misaligned, and I recited the catechisms. He watched my pupils and the rhythm of my hands, and then he placed his palm against my helmet and muttered a blessing that sounded like a maintenance schedule, and I felt better because calibration is a type of mercy we recognize. Time wore into its old shape, and we met an orc war boss who had taught his boys to move like a concept, fast and loud and always in the same direction, until the line either breaks or becomes a wall. We turned his speed into a trap by letting him think he had found a hole, and then closing 3 heavy companies on his flanks. A Titan leg sagged in his last charge, and he tried to climb it as if it were a trophy. I met him at the knee joint and we fought in a rain of sparks and hydraulic hiss. He laughed when I broke his tusk, and I did not laugh when I put my blade where his laugh began. Orcs die honest and wasteful. They are a relief after men. We shipped out again, and the galaxy put us where it needed us. Into a void station mystery, where the air tasted of burnt plastic and the walls sweated condensation like the station was trying to blow. Into a plague city held together by will and habit, where men with no eyebrows manned barricades with discipline and polite hatred for our presence, because they knew we would hold and then leave, and that leaving would return them to the old arithmetic. into a shrine barge that had drifted for 50 years with a single flickering lumen and a chapel full of statues whose eyes bled rust. We cut through and found that its log had been written by a servitor who had learned to mistake counting for prayer. We recited the right prayer and turned off the machine and logged the mercy. The body of my life has been the same in every decade. Order arrives, we prepare, we move, we strike, we hold, we depart, we repair, we train. Across those repetitions, a thin thread has survived. A sound like the small bell my mother taught me to pull very gently so the stone would sing and not shout. The thread shows itself when the work is finished and the servitors hum and the scent of oil is patient. Sometimes during the cleaning of my bolter, I smell baking where there is none, and I know it is the mind, trying to remind the body that it was once simpler. The memory is not an indulgence, it is a gauge. It tells me I am not completely a list of functions. The iron hands teach that the flesh is weak and the machine is faithful, and that truth has saved worlds and brought men back from ruin. It has also shaved from me the tenderness that once made certain choices unbearable. The Imperium gains a weapon and loses a man. I accept the exchange because there is no world in which I have the privilege of using it and still staying honest. Yet as the centuries advance, and the paint on my plates remembers more campaigns than I do, I begin to collect a new set of numbers. The count of times I have seen a citizen look at us as if we were weather and not men. The count of times I have watched an inquisitor count lives as if they were beads. The count of times a governor has asked for our presence to terrify his rivals, and then spoken to us with a smile that slips when he thinks we are not watching. I add those numbers to the kill tallies and the ammunition counts, and the hours of reactor maintenance, and the days we have kept a convoy from being erased by simple greed. The sum grows, and the result is a clarity that belongs to endings. We are not the story the children tell themselves when they fall asleep under a fresco. We are the loud truth of a civilization that survives by deciding that survival is a virtue higher than gentleness. The work has made me the instrument that keeps that decision honest, and that is the most generous word I can give it. Soon this deployment will close, and the captain will read another slate, and the augurs will point, and the engines will answer with their long, patient breath, and I will stand in the arming chapel while the servitors check the seals and the cosalund. Iron Father taps my gorget with the arming cog, and I will speak the words that lock the last human syllables inside a case where they will not interfere, and when the order to deploy comes through the vox, I will step forward again into a corridor or a trench or a hull that groans like a cathedral at dawn, and I will do what I was made to do. The outro waits ahead of me like a gate I have not yet been told to open. It will come when the ledger closes, and the bell in my chest strikes without a hand upon the rope. When that hour arrives, I will say what remains to be said about what we become and why the galaxy requires it. Until then, I continue this line. I continue this function. I continue this march toward the final words with the same economy I bring to every other task. The next order is forming in the static, and I am ready to receive it.